Our theme this week is complexity. We've just finished a quick tour of India's calendar to learn about some of the holidays and important events that occur throughout a year in India. Essentially, this is the diversity that we explored in the previous week, translating itself into the complex Indian system. We could demonstrate how this principle plays out in a number of other ways. I'd like to choose the task of defining India's middle class as an example of this. By doing so, I'll be able to draw on many of the issues that demonstrate India's complexity. First, looking back at week 1, we discussed how India is currently the fastest growing major economy in the world, and that many economic projections expect India to be one of the 3 largest economies by the middle of the century, and the largest at some point in the second half. However, this is an aggregate view, and although we have already discussed a little bit the per capita approach and income inequality, let's revisit this now in a bit more detail. It is possible India could be the largest economy in the world, on one hand, but not be a high-income country on the other. This is a paradox that I don't believe we have really experienced in human history to the extent that we shall in the 21st century. America is both high income and the world's largest economy. Britain was too during its time at the top. When you have the Indian government sitting down at a negotiating table in decades to come, are its representatives representing the world's largest economy or one of its largest? Or are they representing some of the poorest people on the planet? Let me show you what I mean by this complexity. Let's pose ourselves the formidable task of determining how many people in India are middle class. How many are poor and how many are rich? How is income distributed? And how does India compare to that of other countries in this respect? This is a very important debate across the world. We've recently seen Occupy Wall Street protests, Thomas Piketty's book Capital becoming a bestseller, and Jaron Lanier's warnings of winner-take-all siren servers, concentrating wealth in the hands of a tiny few as digital technology disrupts 20th century paradigms. The importance of a middle class is well established in a variety of literatures. For example, it is seen to be a key force in advocating for a transparent and accountable government. But the difficulty is that recent studies have estimated the size of India's middle class anywhere from 24 million people to 246 million people. These studies, all of which can be found in the further resource section below, come to wildly different findings due to relying on different data sets and setting different benchmarks. I'm going to cite a few for you. Credit Suisse had a 2015 Global Wealth Data Book released last year, and it pegged India's middle class at 24 million people. A Pew Research Center study said 32 million. A McKinsey Global Institute report using data from India's National Council of Applied Economic Research gave 50 million, but projected an increase to 583 million for 2025. The Center for Global Development estimated 69 million using data from the National Sample Survey. NCAER, in its own study, came up with a figure of 153 million. And finally, a World Bank working paper estimated India's middle class at an astonishing 246 million. Judging by these studies, this could mean anything from 3% to 24% of India's population are considered middle class. Which is correct? Well, it all depends on how you choose to define middle class. What level of income or wealth is most appropriate? We have the same dilemma in determining a measure of poverty. If you are to dive into one of these studies, I'd recommend the one from the Pew Research Center, which includes interactive online tools for comparing countries and data. Using the 2011 PPP prices, Pew applied the following benchmarks. A daily per capita income of less than $2 per day is poor. $2 to $10 is low income, and $10 to $20 is middle class. It positions the bulk of India's population, 77%, as low income. Compared to global averages, India has more poor and low income people and fewer middle, upper middle and high income people. India's upper middle and high income population add up to less than 1%. I'd also encourage you to visit the Pew data online to see how India's distribution compares to the United States and to China. The Pew data also shows a big change from 2001. India's major progress in the last decade or so in this regard has been advancing 15.6% of its population from poor to low income. But gains to what Pew considers, middle class are still small. There are even smaller gains for upper middle and high income groups. The complexity of defining a middle class does not end with differences over data sets and benchmarks. The very concept of middle class can be elusive. What if people feel like they are middle class, even if their income data suggests otherwise? In a recent survey, major survey, close to half of any income bracket in India self-identified as middle class. Amazingly, 45% of both the highest income group and the lowest income group define themselves as middle class. How does this compare to self-identification of the middle class in the US? Well, it is surprisingly similar in that despite being much richer, Pew and Gallup surveys have reported that about half of Americans identify as middle class, the same figure as India. However, while the trend in America points down following the financial crisis in 2008, the trend in India points up. With such a huge variety of estimates, sometimes I think maybe a consumption-based approach gives a better picture. What do Indians own? And that we can visualize. The census, conducted once a decade, is really helpful for this. Unfortunately, the last data we have is from 2011. But we also have the 2001 data, so we can see the trend from 2001 to 2011. In terms of the percentage of households that own various amenities. 4.7% of Indian households in 2011 had a car, a Jeep or a van. 21% have a scooter, and 45% a bicycle. 47% of households in 2011 had a TV, up from 32% in 2001. You'll notice in this table the striking difference between urban and rural, particularly in certain amenities like electricity, where in 2011 only 55% of rural households had electricity for lighting, compared to 93% of urban households. This is one of the major areas that the current government is looking to improve by reaching out to villages, tens of thousands a year, and adding them to the grid. 81% of urban households had an in-house toilet, compared to only 31% in rural India. Another one of the government's priorities over the next few years, as we heard in the earlier week, and we'll look at again later in the week, is improving sanitation. It's easy to see how deceiving an all-India average for anything can be. Remember how diverse India is. A similar variety in this data could be seen if we looked at the data state by state, with huge variations in the ownership of TVs, cars, etc., from one part of the country to the other, and even with access to electricity. A great way to visualize this regional variation is by looking at a satellite image of India at night. Here in white, you can see the bright lights, where obviously there is electricity. But you'll notice in the center of India, it's a lot darker. And in the north of the country, there are surprisingly little electricity, considering this is where 600 million people and half the population of the country live, in the states of Uttar Pradesh, which has a population the size of Brazil, and the state to its east, Bihar. In the next unit, we will take a closer look at the rural-urban divide and unwrap yet another layer of India's complexity by getting beyond generalizations that in many cases can be deceiving.